Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vous remercie d'être présents avec nous aujourd'hui
Good
pour ce
afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here today. MRIP, the Mobilization of Domestic Public Resources, is organizing this webinar. And this platform aims at talking about challenges around taxation. The objective of today's seminar is to exchange on tax and gender. Recent research shows that there are gender biases, explicit or implicit, regardless of the region in the world we're talking about. These researchers show that taking into account those biases would contribute to making these systems fairer, and this would have an impact on formal and informal economy. This said, the question is how to identify those biases in tax systems. What are those impacts regarding social inequalities that are already existing? And then once we've got those biases, what actions can politicians, tax administrations, or development partners do to correct those inequalities? So today we're going to try and answer those questions through the speeches of various panelists. We'll see at what international organizations are doing and what can be done to meet those challenges. So we've got 5 panelists today, quality panelists who are going to talk today. First, Catherine Baer of the IMF, who is going to present a recent study called Gender and Revenue Administration, Principles and Practices. Then Michelle Harding, who's the main economist and specialist of tax analysis at the OECD, who will present the OECD's recent work concerning gender and taxation. Vanessa van den Boogaard at ICTD, who manages research and projects, and who will present taxation and gender with a focus on informal economy. Then Sophie Lambert at UN Women, who will describe the sectoral gender analysis of the Moroccan tax system. And finally, Eugénie Ribaud, who works at Expertise France, who will present current strategies for integrating gender considerations into technical assistance projects within the field of taxation. So as you can see, 5 panelists today, which means we will have to be careful with timing. So I will ask our 5 panelists to be synthetic and to speak no longer than 10 minutes so that we have some time left for questions at the end of this. So without further ado, we're going to start with the first presentation by Catherine Baer. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, François. Si vous me permettez, je vais présenter en anglais.
Thank you very much, François. I will be speaking in English. You have received my presentation. We can have a look at the slides, I think. You can share your screen, actually. And please feel free to speak English because we will have interpretation into French. So there's no problem. So please feel free to share your screen, and I'm going to do that immediately. Can you see my presentation? We can see it. Perhaps you can put it full screen mode. Just a second. Here we go. There you are. That's better.
Very good. Good afternoon, my dear colleagues. It is my pleasure to open this webinar, I should say, on gender and fiscal issues. And let me dive right in to begin to discuss gender, a topic that is part of what we in the Fiscal Affairs Department are researching and focusing on also in our capacity development activities, and that is gender and revenue administration. and I will highlight a few of the points that we make in our technical note. Of course, gender equality is very important as an enabler of social and economic empowerment. And we focus in our paper on the connections between revenue administration and gender equality, which is a topic that is relatively new and that we ourselves have been learning about as we go about our work. I will say a couple of words about how revenue administrations can contribute to closing gender gaps or promoting gender equality, and that is by first applying a gender lens to administering tax laws and facilitating trade, and then building a gender-balanced workforce, which are two slightly different aspects of how we identify how revenue administrations can contribute to gender equality. So first of all, as Francois has already stated in his opening words, gender equality is an enabler for social and economic empowerment. Just by way of repeating the overall principles that guides us, gender equality addresses the right to freedom from bias or favoritism based on a person's gender, and also closing gender gaps can lead to significant improvements in social outcomes and economic development. Just a word or two on the second point that the IMF has undertaken research from a few years ago demonstrating that closing gender gaps can increase the GDP, country's GDP on the order of 35%. So these are very significant gains that my macroeconomic colleagues working on gender issues have identified or estimated as a result of closing gender gaps. And also in recognition of this importance, the IMF last year has introduced a gender mainstreaming, a gender strategy in which we are focusing on this important issue from many different perspectives, the fiscal policy and institutions being just one of these. So let's look at how we can connect gender equality and revenue administration. And this is a very nice table that highlights how gender equality in a country can contribute to economic growth and better social outcomes. And there are several ways and several channels for doing that, including, of course, government taking action to improve gender equality by having programs and interventions to improve, to close gender gaps, and developing policies to increase women's contribution to the economy. Of course, revenue administration is an important government actor, and revenue administrations play a fundamental role in collecting revenues that are used to fund government programs, and also implementing tax policies, incentives, and trade facilitation measures that can promote women's participation in the economy. Of course, this effectiveness by the revenue administration depends on one hand on its organizational effectiveness internally and vis-a-vis other government agencies, and its interaction with taxpayers and foreign trade operators. So through all of these, there is a gender dimension. As I mentioned earlier, the two focuses or the two streams that our paper focuses on and discusses are the two channels by which we observe that revenue administration can contribute to gender equality. One is by administering gender-sensitive tax laws effectively and applying a gender lens when administering tax or trade laws. Of course, this is very important as a way of really the revenue administration's main role, as well as providing feedback to ministries of finance and other government agencies regarding the administration or as an input into tax and trade law formulation that can affect the segment that we consider to be women in the economy or women in the labor force. So the first channel or way in which the revenue administration can contribute, as I mentioned, to gender equality is by administering gender-sensitive tax laws and actually knowing what these laws are. This is another important point. What are gender-sensitive tax laws and implementing them effectively? And then, of course, within the organization, building a gender-balanced and inclusive workforce. So there are ways in which revenue administrations can ensure they have an effective engagement with women, taxpayers, and traders. This implies understanding the barriers to women's economic participation, whether this be access to education, access to the financial sector, even in many countries, something as simple as access to transportation, and barriers to accessing the tax system, understanding the trade and tax laws and regulations, and knowing what their obligations are, and how to approach the tax and customs administrations. And as I mentioned earlier, this effective engagement with women taxpayers and traders also means using a gender lens in administering the tax and trade laws. And this includes reducing the compliance and enforcement bias. We identify biases such as having reduced hours of taxpayer services that make it difficult for working women or for women in the home to approach the revenue administration for information or for assistance, and also having compliance programs that do not take into account, for example, women in certain sectors that are strongly represented as small or medium-sized taxpayers and traders in certain sectors like hospitality or the service sector. So ensuring that the revenue administration is aware that in administering the tax and trade laws, there's a need for a greater focus on women as a segment of the tax-paying and trading universe. I want to say a little bit about the current picture of women in revenue administrations, because this is also an important aspect of our analysis. And here we use information from the ISORA survey, International Survey on Revenue Administration for 2021, and also from the World Customs Organization, to show that most tax administrations employ more women than men across countries. This is shown here in these bar charts, where tax administrations, more than half of the revenue administration staff are female staff. The reverse is true for customs administrations, where because of very often and across countries, the focus on enforcement and policing means that customs is dominated more by men. That said, in both customs and tax administrations, women are underrepresented at the executive and senior management levels, where the percent of female executives is clearly below the percent of female staff. So there is work to do in both tax and customs administration to promote women in the executive cadres of those organizations. And this will undoubtedly have a link, have an effect on the topic I just was discussing regarding the bias of revenue administration programs and the awareness of the need to have gender-focused and gender-focused programs the awareness of the bias of the current programs, and then awareness of the impact on women and women as taxpayers and traders of the tax and trade laws. So there is a link between these two. Let me talk about some of the factors that we have identified in obtaining a better gender balance in revenue administrations. And here I think these are very nice, concrete guidance for countries and for administrations as they go about becoming more aware of this issue and planning toward the future. First is having gender equality planning, setting organization-wide targets in the revenue administration strategic and business plans, establishing key performance indicators, and then monitoring and reporting against these. It's important for organizations to have specific indicators and measure progress towards those organization-wide targets. And many, even what we have seen, emerging market revenue administrations do not have such key performance indicators. Of course, policies promoting workplace equality are very important for everyone, also including women. Anti-discrimination, harassment, and parental leave policies are important. And last but certainly not least, as we have seen as a result of the pandemic, is having flexible work arrangements, allowing and having remote work policies, flexible hours, and job sharing that is meaningful and implementable. And basically this bar chart to the right shows the proportion of administrations that have some of these policies. And as you can see, there is still a way to go in terms of these enabling policies, if you will. So just by way of some final thoughts to leave you with and to guide our discussion this morning, women's full and effective participation in the workforce and decent work for all are critical to achieving an inclusive and sustainable economic growth, and the numbers are there as evidence of this. Revenue administrations are key fiscal institutions, so managing and reforming them through a gender lens can definitely contribute to achieving more inclusive and sustainable growth, and in our view should become an integral part of fiscal reform blueprints, especially both on the operational side and institutional side. So some concrete ways that revenue administrations can help close gender gaps and at the same time supporting government's revenue mobilization efforts are actions like promoting gender equality within the revenue administration, expanding women's inclusion in the tax system, providing input into the design of gender-sensitive tax policies through close cooperation with the Ministry of Finance and, of course, other agencies in many countries, and ensuring there's good cooperation between the tax and customs administration to administer gender-sensitive tax laws. So with that, I just want to thank you. This is the technical note and from which I am basing my remarks this morning, which is online and available. And thank you very much for your time and attention. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Catherine. Effectivement, tous les liens et les présentations seront disponibles.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. Yes, indeed. You will find all of the links online. There are questions, but I suggest that we move on to the next presentation, which is Michel from the OECD.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vais aussi m'exprimer en anglais. Alors.
Pas de problème.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak today, and thank you to Catherine for the opening presentation. So I'm going to focus my discussion today on some of the work that the OECD has been doing in the area of tax policy and gender equality. And as Catherine discussed, there are a number of imperatives for looking at the impact of tax policy in this space. Firstly, of course, gender equality is a human right. And as Catherine outlined, it has very strong implications for economic growth and also for COVID-19
the COVID-19 recovery, particularly with the cost of living crisis. Tax policy can impact gender equality via a number of different mechanisms, either directly or indirectly. It can obviously do it directly in that it directly impacts women's incomes, also consumption decisions, but it can provide different incentives as well indirectly for men and women to participate in the economy, either as workers, business owners, consumers, or land or property owners. And gender biases within tax systems are generally discussed as falling into one of two different groups. The first is explicit biases. These are the direct biases that arise in tax systems where you have a tax system that has deliberately differentiated provisions for men and for women, either in the text of the law or in formal applications of the law via tax administrations or tax policies. And these are becoming much more uncommon today than they were in the past, at least insofar as they worsen gender equality. In the past, some examples that we have seen in terms of explicit bias in tax systems were that some countries had higher tax rates for married women than they did for single men in the personal income tax system. This was the case in the Netherlands until the 1980s and in South Africa until the 1990s. We also see it on the tax administration side. Some countries still have requirements that married women can only access their tax data if they have the permission of their husband. And this was the case in Jersey, for example, until 2020. And there are still a few examples out there, particularly in the realm of tax credits, that can worsen gender equality if they are available to married men and not to married women. An example of this is in Morocco, where married men automatically get household tax credits, but married women have to prove that they are the breadwinner before they are entitled to them. However, explicit bias is becoming more rare, and it's most likely a smaller issue than implicit biases in the tax system. And these biases occur when the tax system looks neutral on the face of it, but in fact interacts with differences in how men and women interact with the economy in ways that lead to gender bias. And so by way of example, in the labour force, we know that women are less likely to participate in the labour force than men do. We know that when they do, they will work less hours, they tend to earn lower wages, and we also know that women are more responsive to changes in wage rates than men are. And all of these things mean that a tax system that looks neutral on the face of it can interact with these characteristics and these differences between men and women in ways that lead to gender bias in practice, even though it is not shown in law. And there's the well-documented case of the second earner, where you have the case that most women are second earners, most second earners are women. And so a tax system that has high progressive rates or family-based taxation can penalize women entering the labour force. There are a number of ways that tax policy can impact gender equality in the implicit sphere. And I just spoke about labour market participation. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I wanted to highlight a couple more in particular. Another example is in consumption. So in consumption taxes, prima facie, it looks like men may pay more consumption taxes than women. And the rationale for this is that, firstly, women are more likely to purchase things that are zero rated or have reduced rates under VAT systems, things like education, food, and healthcare. Whereas men are typically more likely to purchase things like tobacco, fuel, vehicles that are subject to high VAT rates and often excises on top. However, the fact that this is the case at face value does not necessarily show us much about the gender impact of consumption taxation, because firstly, it's not clear who is purchasing the goods and who is using the goods within the family, and secondly, the purchase of some goods may reduce family income in other ways that have a gender impact that we simply cannot measure. So the gender impact of consumption taxes is much more difficult to measure. Similarly, on corporate taxation, data is relatively lacking, but we know that shareholders tend to be majority men, that men receive higher levels of dividend income and of capital gains income from corporates, and that men are more likely to be represented in boards and senior management within companies. And this raises the question of who benefits more from corporate tax rate cuts or from incentives provided to the corporate sector. And so one example that I'll look into a bit more detail in implicit bias is the taxation of part-time work. And this builds on a working paper that we released last year, where we built on our modelling for second income earners and expanded this to the taxation of part-time work. This is a gender issue because women are far more likely to work part-time than men are. on average, this is true in all OECD countries, but on average in the OECD, 3 out of 10 women work part-time, whereas only 1 out of 10 men work part-time. When women do work part-time, with only 3 exceptions, they earn lower wages than the men who are working part-time. They also tend to work longer hours than men working part-time. And what we find when we look at the impact of tax on part-time workers is that there's a double impact of personal income tax systems on gender equality. The first is that the progressivity of the tax system in most OECD countries reduces the wage gap between part-time workers, who are mostly female, and full-time workers, who are mostly male, by approximately 24%. And this is simply because most OECD countries tax higher incomes at higher rates. It also reduces the gap between the wages of part-time women and part-time men for exactly the same reason. However, there's a flip side to this. It's a double-edged sword because the progressivity of income tax systems in OECD countries also creates a disincentive for part-time workers to move to full-time work. And this is what's shown on the next slide. If you focus on the blue bars in particular, the blue bars show the amount of income that is taxed away when moving from part-time to full-time work across OECD countries. And you can see that in 11 OECD countries, more than 40% of the additional income from moving to full-time work is taxed away. In Belgium, it's nearly 60%. And in almost every case, this is significantly higher than the tax rate that would apply to the part-time worker before they move to full-time work. The dots in this graph show the situation for a single worker. The blue bars show the situation for a second earner. In many cases, it's the same, but in a number of countries, we see that a single worker who's moving from part-time to full-time work will face a lower tax rate than the married worker. And this is predominantly because of the reduction in tax credits when a second earner moves into full-time employment. This is also the situation for individuals without children. And so if we added children to the mix, the difference would be even more stark because you would need to add things like childcare cost to the equation. A second study that we released last year was a survey or a stock taking of how countries are approaching tax and gender issues more broadly. And we did this because we wanted to get past the focus on personal income tax that had been a lot of the motivation for our early work. And so we looked beyond OECD countries. We had 43 countries in total, and we asked countries to report back on all of the different areas you can see on the screen here, including explicit and implicit biases that I mentioned before, also what their priorities were, how they take gender into account in the tax policy development process, what data they have available to them, and their priorities for future work and for next steps. So I'll touch very briefly on the findings for that study. Firstly, we found that roughly 3/4 of the countries that replied said that gender was at least somewhat important as a consideration in the tax policy design process, although a few countries said it was of little or no importance. Consistent with what we had understood, very few countries explicit bias in the tax system, and those that did predominantly reported explicit bias that was designed to reduce rather than to exacerbate gender biases. And these include things like special deductions for women, including in Spain and Argentina, as well as tax credits in Israel and in Singapore for married women or married women with children. And we also asked about implicit bias. This was found to be much more common. Nearly half of the countries surveyed said that there was a risk of implicit bias for a number of different reasons, including some of those we've discussed, the level and nature of income, the fact that we have individual household taxation, differences in consumption patterns, or different social expectations for men and women. Another striking finding from the report was only 1/3 of countries routinely look at the impact of tax policy on gender equality as part of their design process. And even when they do, it is rare to find guidance and clear policy objectives for doing so. In fact, only 6 countries reported this. One of the other questions we asked them was, what data do you have available to you to make tax policy decisions? And we found that in general, countries have relatively good access to data on women and men's incomes and their labour force participation, as well as their business participation. But they have considerably less good access to data on consumption and property and wealth ownership, which impedes analysis in this area. Finally, the study looked at how countries could respond to gender bias in tax policy. And we discuss a framework which divides the tax impact on gender by two dimensions. The first is whether or not it is explicit or implicit, but the second is whether or not it worsens or ameliorates gender equality. So where you have explicit biases that worsen gender equality, like some of those I mentioned earlier, the policy response is ideally to remove them. The situation is a little more complicated when you have implicit bias which worsens gender equality, for example, the taxation of second earners or part-time workers, where the tax system itself does not have an obvious bias, but where it has an obvious outcome that is biased. And here we suggest that policymakers reconsider whether the tax system can be structured in a neutral way that reduces that gender bias. So moving from household to individual taxation, for example. Then if you have explicit bias which actually reduces gender equality, some of the tax credits I was talking about for married or working mothers, the policy response that we suggest here is that countries evaluate very carefully if this is the best tool to reduce gender equality, and if so, what are its impacts on other elements of tax system design? What does it do to tax revenues? What does it do to other dimensions of equity, for example, sole parents? And what does it do in terms of creating arbitrage opportunities within the tax system? And finally, if there are implicit biases within the tax system that promote gender equality or reduce inequality, like the progressivity of the tax system, these are to be promoted in tax policy design wherever possible. I will stop here, but just to comment very briefly as well, that the OECD is working on tax administration as well as tax policy dimensions of gender equality. We have the Forum on Tax Administration Gender Balance Network, Women Leaders in Tax Transparency, and I'll put a particular plug in for our tax administration series, which is being released tomorrow, in fact, the latest edition, which will have new numbers on the proportion of women in tax administrations across the OECD, as well as proportion of executives in tax administrations that are women. So that will be released on our website tomorrow. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Merci beaucoup, Michel. Merci beaucoup aussi pour ces dernières annonces.
Thank you for this presentation and your news. Vanessa, what can you tell us about informal economy?
Vanessa.
Okay, perfect. Can you see my screen okay? Is the sizing of that all right?
Oui. Oui,
okay.
oui, c'est bon.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much to everyone. Some really excellent presentations to get us started. I'm going to discuss some of the ICTD's research on gender and taxation, giving particular thought to the issues that are of most relevance in lower income context, particularly focused on the implications of large informal economies and the prevalence of informal institutions of governance and public finance. So much of the research on gender and tax to date has focused on high-income countries. And while there is a tendency to apply lessons from high-income countries to lower-income ones, doing so can be problematic as it leads us to overlook the ways in which people actually interact with tax systems in these contexts. And despite some limited structural evidence, some evidence of structural bias, I should say, in formal tax systems that Michelle noted, in practice, the impact of these formal explicit biases is limited in lower income contexts, as very few people actually pay personal income taxes or other central government taxes. Personal income taxes represent a much lower proportion of taxes collected than in high-income countries, while administrative data shows us that most people formally pay almost nothing in direct taxes at the national level. And the same is true at the subnational level, where data shows that people pay very small amounts to local governments. Nevertheless, much of the existing policy-oriented work around tax and gender tends to approach the topic through a narrow lens, predominantly focused on identifying biases in formal tax policy at the national level and thinking through the associated systems of filing or exemptions. This misses, we argue, the issues that actually result in the biggest gender differences in lower income contexts. While direct taxation is often limited in these countries, small taxpayers and women in particular are more likely to be affected by a range of other payments, which we can group into two categories. First, thinking about the impacts of strategies to tax the informal economy, including presumptive taxes on small businesses in the informal sector and things like market taxes and fees. And second, the impact of small user fees for people to access essential public goods and services, and of informal taxes, which are payments made outside of the formal tax system to finance local public goods. And together, these payments are often much more important to understanding individuals' experience of tax system, as well as the related gendered differences. So first, while there's limited research on the impacts of the taxation of the informal economy, evidence shows that it does have significant gender impacts. So for instance, some of my research on the informal sector taxation and presumptive taxation in Ghana makes clear that informal sector taxation is highly regressive, with higher burdens on lower income groups, which are dominated by women. And this is unsurprising in many ways. It's the case certainly where fees are levied at a flat rate, but we find in Ghana that it is the case even where presumptive tax regimes are progressive on paper. The degree of progressivity of these regimes often isn't sufficient to make up for the very low incomes at the bottom income quintiles of the informal economy. We also find that presumptive tax regimes in this context are highly discriminatory, with the outcomes of taxation often depending on the ease of administration. So highly visible and concentrated groups, including market vendors, who in many contexts are dominated by women, are more likely to face taxation because they're easier for tax collectors to target. By contrast, higher income groups in the informal economy, including professionals or thinking about tax evasion by registered firms, are often more easily left off the administrative hook with gendered implications. And further, while standard analyses of taxation don't consider things like user fees, they often don't consider local government taxes, and they don't consider informal taxes. We need to take these into account if we want to understand the ways in which citizens actually engage with systems of public finance and how those affect men and women differently. These types of payments emerge commonly where there are weak fiscal foundations to fund public services, with evidence suggesting that they have a greater impact on women, who end up paying more in relation to their income to access things like water and education and healthcare. I'll give a few quick examples now of what this can look like in practice. So first, increasing research in this area has drawn attention to the ways in which market fees and associated levies can create gender inequities. So for instance, if women or men are overrepresented among those trading in markets, and markets are taxed more or more heavily than other economic activities, or if women or men are overrepresented in the categories of sellers or traders that are relatively heavily taxed. So an ICTD study of small-scale traders in flea markets in Zimbabwe provides evidence of bias along these dimensions. So it finds that 75% of traders in relatively high tax markets are women, and they also find that women earn less than male traders in those same markets. It points out that regardless of their income, market traders pay daily taxes amounting to about $25 a month, which is relatively high in relation to traders' earnings, which are on average less than $500 a month. This means that though the absolute amounts are very small, the tax is about $1.25 a day, the effective tax rates end up being proportionately higher than the equivalent personal income tax rates in the formal sector. Another ICTD study of market fees in Tanzania shows the way in which small fees can have big impacts. So here in this context, market fees are comparatively low. There was little evidence of gender bias in the impact of these fees, but fees for the use of public toilets dramatically exceeded market fees. The average overall cost to women ended up being about double that for men. I think this is unsurprising, as women working in markets have fewer options to relieve themselves throughout the day. But somewhat shockingly, some women ended up paying up to 20% of their daily income just to use public toilets in markets. And finally, my research in Sierra Leone finds gendered impacts of both formal and informal taxes and user fees. So while tax payment to the national government is actually extremely uncommon in most of the country, at least outside of Freetown, and local government revenues amount to only about $1 per capita. Both user fees and informal taxes are widely paid and significant in relation to household income across the country. Here, female-headed households pay fewer formal taxes and user fees than male-headed households, which may be surprising given their lower incomes, though they are more likely to pay more in relation to their income than equivalent male-headed households. And this is despite no explicit biases in tax policy. And this is true across all of the most prominent types of formal taxes, which are concentrated at the local level. It's also true of user fees and informal taxes in this context, which, because they're more likely to be flat fees or more likely to be regressive, can lead likewise to discrimination in access to services for women and girls if they're required to access basic public goods like water or education. And again, if we only look at if we're only looking at formal taxes or at the national level, when thinking about gender inequities in these types of contexts, we wouldn't find much in the way of gender differences. In fact, we would see that women are paying less in formal taxes because they're less likely to be registered at the national level as taxpayers. But if we start our analyses and start to take into consideration what people are actually paying and the day-to-day realities of gender and tax, we may be in a better place to be thinking about how to address gender inequities. So just to wrap up here, I'll highlight just a few implications of this work. So first, the realities of high informality and the prevalence of informal systems of public finance in lower income contexts can make clear that we need to understand the realities of how taxpayers actually experience taxation and public finance, paying attention to, for instance, the ways in which the informal sector is taxed, the prevalence and impact of subnational taxes, of user fees, of informal taxes, and recognizing that gender inequities are embedded in both formal and informal structures and institutions, so that we need to take both of those into account. Second, and building on this, in context of high informality, the greatest impact that we may be able to have in addressing gender inequities may be related to rethinking about how we tax the informal economy. There's been considerable policy enthusiasm in expanding taxation in the informal economy, things like undertaking registration drives to capture informal firms. I think we should rethink the utility of this, not just because of the gendered impacts, but also because increasing research shows that this administrative policy focus often doesn't lead to revenue gains and can have other negative equity impacts. But at the very least, I think we need to think about how to better design presumptive tax regimes to target higher income earners in the informal economy, and in particular, how to tax less visible but by higher income earning sectors. And finally, greater attention can be paid to rationalizing small and informal taxes and user fees, reducing these burdens for the poor, which would address some of the gender inequities that I've highlighted today, while a more fundamental focus on progressive tax policy would serve to reduce inequities in the tax system, particularly given the concentration of women at the low end of the earning spectrum. I will leave it there for now. I look forward to the discussion.
Merci, Vanessa, pour cette présentation très intéressante.
Thank you, Vanessa. That was really interesting. And we're going to move straight on with Sophie Lambert from UN Women. She's going to be talking about Morocco.
Merci beaucoup. J'essaie juste de... Ici. OK. Donc, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je suis Sophie Lambert, coordinatrice
Hello, everyone. My name is Sophie Lambert, UN Women in Morocco, and together with the Ministry of Economy and Finance, we had a study of the taxation system in Morocco. So briefly, I'll explain the context of the analysis, the objectives, the methodology we used, and the main results and recommendations that came out of it. In terms of context, you have to understand that Morocco is a pioneer in gender-aware budgetization. It started in the years 2000, and then provisions were included within an organic law in 2015. This organic law introduces a reform of the system which links public spending to public policy results. And that includes gender result-based management. This led to objectives and follow-up indicators being created within the budgetary programs. The gender analysis became an essential step for any planning of a budget program that is gender aware. What it focuses on is public spending. So far, we haven't looked at tax. We hadn't. And in 2022, the ministry decided to focus on the tax and customs system and to have that same analysis. The various administrations, the tax directorate, the administration of customs and indirect taxes were all involved. Within the study, what we tried to do is focus on legislative and administrative aspects of the gender analysis. We elaborated a diagnosis and we accompanied the customs administration and the tax directorate in their action plan and helped in a technical manner as well. The methodology focused on 3 levels. It's a methodology which we use whenever we're managing a gender analysis at UN Women. So we look at macro level, at meso level, where we focus on institutional aspects. So we do a gender audit of the administration itself in HR, work-life balance aspects, access by women to decision-making posts, and then at micro level, which is where we look at target groups, we look at tax and customs administration together with users. Here, I'm going to focus on macro and micro levels, focusing on explicit and implicit biases, which we identified. We adopted a qualitative methodology with interviews in 6 regions in order to have a mapping of Morocco. We consulted with the 3 directorates of the Ministry of the Economy and of Finances. We also talked to the private sector and civil society of those 6 regions. What did we notice on a macro level? The methodology, the study showed a resistance to gender aspects in the tax systems. It was a challenge throughout the study, in fact. People were strongly attached to equality of taxpayers, regardless of sex, and the perception that neutrality is essential. In general, what we notice is that there are no explicit biases towards women, apart from income tax, which is Law 74 of the tax code. This article says that the man is the head of the family and that he is responsible for his wife and his children. As such, he gets a tax reduction. This consideration shows a gendered stereotype because even if a woman taxpayer can get reductions the same way as a man, it appears that she has to prove that she is responsible for her family, whereas men don't have to. So we suggested another formulation so that it is no longer gendered. The administration has already accepted it, so that now men and women are aligned, so that they are now co-responsible in terms of money. We also looked at implicit biases in the tax system in Morocco. Implicit biases are biases where men and women look equal, but the impact is inequitable because of different income, because ownership is treated in a different way when you're a man and a woman, etc. This analysis showed good practices, for example, on income tax, because the income tax system is progressive based on individuals, which helps women who tend to have a lower revenue, a lower income. However, there are reductions for some jobs, a reduction of 45% for those who work on marine sectors, for example, which impact mainly men. On corporate tax, the good practice in Morocco is that in dedicated regimes, so for example, small businesses are put at an advantage, which is an advantage for women. The marginal rate of 31%, though, could be a disadvantage to women who tend to have smaller parts, so smaller share in companies in the country. Reduced rates can be favorable to women who work in farming and the fishing industry, but women tend to spend more for essential goods, and so VAT is disadvantage, an implicit disadvantage to women because the rate isn't reduced on some products like feminine hygiene products, which are essential as well. We also looked at implicit biases in terms of capital, in terms of ownership and assets. So we don't have all the data, but it does seem that whether we're talking about property or wealth ownership, will provisions are a disadvantage for women. The absence of taxation on wealth and property are biases that tend to be more favorable to men than women. We looked at customs duties. Several bilateral and multilateral agreements were signed by Morocco, which make them lower. There are no explicit biases against women in Moroccan customs. Implicit biases were more difficult to study. In terms of customs duty, what we can conclude is probably that exonerations over exports, like farming goods, could be positive for women who work in farming quite a lot. Although I am not quite sure, because women tend to be at the bottom of the scale, even in the farming industry. So I'm not sure that those exonerations have a positive impact on women. So in general, I would say that a more in-depth audit is necessary to assess the impact of those duties towards women. However, the Customs Administration has adopted a gender-based strategy which aims at reinforcing the presence of women in customs jobs. And so there is an increase in the number of women in customs jobs. I see that time's running, so I'll go quickly over micro levels. So we had a look at target groups, users, women cooperatives, and the informal sector. There is no differentiation between men and women, and there wasn't a digitization effort. The Customs Administration has digitalized its systems, which has increased efficiency, reduced physical interactions between taxpayers and civil servants, which reduces the risks of harassment, fraud, etc. However, there is no ventilated data, gender ventilated data, which makes it difficult to assess whether the tax procedures have made a difference in terms of gender. Same with cooperatives. There are tax incentives. We know that women cooperatives have difficulties in filling in their tax documents because they are missing information and they have constraints. They have to go through intermediaries. So they tend to have more difficulties. In terms of customs, we looked at target groups, so clients, cooperatives, informal sector. Apart from corporal searches of women by women, there is no differentiation on the part of customs. Digitization remains a challenge. We know that some clients have to deal with constraints in transport. All women don't have a mode of transportation to get to the airport. Also, there is no specific communication to women. Same thing with cooperatives. As far as the informal sector goes, women create informal businesses and get merchandise, cosmetics, food complements, but we don't have enough data at this stage in order to have conclusive conclusions to make. In terms of recommendations, the legislation in taxation, we suggested more balance between direct and indirect tax. We suggested modifying Article 74 of the tax code in order to get rid of the gendered formulation. We suggested giving reductions between 20 and 45% in a more balanced way to different professions. We suggested reducing tax spending, looking at VAT, for instance, when dealing with female hygiene protections, and also look at loss of earnings for the state while promoting gender equality. On customs, we recommended integrating gender when dealing with tariffs. Maybe customs could look at the negotiations and look at how commerce can be a starting point for women in some sectors, aligning itself with the WTO, and of course, looking at women handling external trade. And the final point, strategy for tax and customs, adopting a transversal gendered approach, initiating and making systematic the production, use, and publication of gender ventilated data, sex disaggregated data, and facilitating operations and communications, especially for women. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sophie. We'll get back to you. There were many questions during your presentation. We'll move on to the final speaker, Eugénie Ribaud, on technical assistance in order to reduce gender biases in the countries in which we intervene.
Thank you,
François. I'm delighted to be able to tell you about Expertise France's work in this field. I will try to go through this quite quickly so we have more time for debate. And before explaining how EF mainstreams gender issues in its development cooperation programs in the area of taxation, I'd like to explain why we decided to do this in the first place. First and foremost, let me explain what Expertise France is. We're a public French agency for the implementation and the design of international technical cooperation projects. And for a number of years now, French diplomacy is feminist. That's the word used. In other words, it tries to take on board in all areas of diplomacy gender issues. Expertise France, EF, being a public agency working with other countries, has to do the same in all of its projects, and particularly any project relating to taxation. The second point I'd like to make about the why is that EF is part of the Agence Française de Développement Group, the French development agency, which has clear quantified objectives for indicators drawn up by the OECD, which measure how gender issues are taken on board in various projects. And Expertise France is part of the French Development Agency and therefore has to comply with those targets. Within the agency more broadly, we have developed our own gender strategy that is then broken down on various areas where we intervene, including taxation. And finally, as to the why, Expertise France has an ambition, which is to support our partner administrations in the design of high-quality tax policies. And as my panelists have said today, rightly, taking on board gender issues in the analysis of tax systems is very important because it can make these tax systems fairer, but also more effective. So that's the why. And on the basis of that, we thought about how to have a gender-based approach to fiscal policies, tax policies. There are two main stakes here. The first stake is to reconsider our practices generally when we implement rollout projects. And the second stake is to have a discussion, exchange on taxation and gender. So the first stake led us to reconsider our own practices in activities that we've already implemented. For instance, have we not forgotten to mainstream gender issues? If we were to reproduce these activities with new projects, how could we correct that failing? And then how can we design activities that are specifically and particularly good at taking on board gender issues in taxation when our partners wish that to be the case? So we really thought hard about our activities, their content, and how we deliver them. What are our activities? Well, they're at the very heart of the technical cooperation projects, obviously. The second objective with this new strategy in our unit is to have an exchange within the unit about gender implications of tax policy and the consequences of these policies so that we can discuss this with our partners. When I say our partners, I mean the administrations we work with in the other countries and our technical and financial partners. They may be donors, they may be NGOs, they may be international organizations or other technical cooperation agencies. So that gives you, I think, a general overview of how we got started with all of this. And now I'd like to give some concrete examples of the kind of activities that we've been carrying out. First of all, a focus on tax policy. One example would be to organize a workshop of awareness raising about gender biases in the tax system. They may be explicit or they may be implicit. Michel explained this very well, and the impact that they have. This kind of workshop can be for people from a Ministry of Finance or a training institute, training people, civil servants, or it could be taxpayers, for instance, if you want to have broader awareness raising. Another example I could give regarding tax policies would be to have a diagnosis or a study, a survey of gender bias in the tax code specific to one or other country. You have to identify that bias, so you need to discuss it with the administration in the country and then work on reforms that might help to alleviate or remove those biases. Finally, and last example relating to tax policy at a more local level this time, it could be to carry out studies for local authorities, for instance, on a bias related to local fees. Vanessa talked about these. It could be market taxes, for instance. It could be tax on the using of public domain. There are lots of biases in this kind of local fee. And local authorities are very often not aware of the issue at all. So if you can identify them, then that's at least a first step to then move towards a reform to a fairer type of user fee structure. Now, regarding tax administration, well, I think in our activities, we need to distinguish between two things. You've got the tax administration as a body, an organization, and then you've got the services provided to taxpayers by this tax administration. In the former case, the tax administration is an organization as such. And Catherine talked about what would happen in that organization, the percentage of men and women working in it, for instance. But you could go further. What about managerial positions, various services? What about career planning and having access to training throughout your career? Are there the same opportunities for men and for women? And then a broader issue about who has the power in tax administrations and in the Ministry of Finance at a higher level. So we can help our partners carry out this kind of study, and we can even issue recommendations for reforms. Then a final point relating to services provided to the taxpayer. There are lots of gender issues there as well. Just some of them. I think you'll understand immediately what I'm getting at. I'm going to express them in the form of a question. Are information campaigns designed to encourage everybody to pay their taxes properly, designed for both or all genders? Are they adapted to all genders? Are the messages clear for all? At local level, you have centers that provide support for taxpayers. Are they designed so that taxpayers who have children with them can come in easily? Is tax literacy the same for women and men? Is there anything done to try and help women to have more information about what their rights and obligations are? Are there campaigns that are gender specific or tailored particularly to women? Do they focus on those taxpayers who have the poorest level of tax literacy, who are generally women? So a lot of questions which can then lead on to studies and then ultimately recommendations. And that's where Expertise France can help our partners to find locally adapted solutions. Here are just a few examples. Now, let me explain how these activities fit in with our technical cooperation projects. We've got two methods in our unit at the moment. The first method is that we go through with a fine-tooth comb all of our tax-related projects, and we look very carefully at the work that remains to be done, because these are all underway already, whether there are gender issues that we've left by the wayside, and can we bring them back in? Can we include them? We need to discuss this with our partners, and sometimes it's a problem because all of a sudden we start talking about gender issues when that wasn't actually broached upstream. But it does mean that you can have technical cooperation projects that are broader, more all-encompassing, and helps us to identify needs that weren't perhaps initially identified. And the second approach, in all of our new projects, when designing new projects together with our partners, we put on our gender lens. We look at the activities that are planned, we discuss them with the partners, and we always see whether it's relevant to bring in a gender focus. Given the specific objectives and the broader objectives of the project, we always ask ourselves whether it might be useful to bring in gender-specific issues relating to tax policies. So we have discussions with our partners, and they can put forward their views. And this means, in turn, that we gain more knowledge about all of this. By way of conclusion, I would like to highlight that the work done by Expertise France to take on board gender issues in our technical assistance projects is quite new. It's fairly new. We're really proceeding with baby steps. We are, however, very ambitious, and our team is very anxious to work on a project that might be specifically dedicated to gender issues in tax systems, so that we can feed this into research and help our partners better to ensure that there is more tax justice. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions. Thank you, Eugénie. I think that Catherine wanted to come in, and then we will have a discussion after hearing Catherine. We have some questions and, in fact, some answers already in the chat. But there are others that remain unanswered and that can feed into the debate. Catherine.
Thank you so much, François. Yes. Very, very brief. But it was just so interesting to hear everybody's presentations that I couldn't help but make a few comments and also clarifications based on the work that we're doing in the IMF. First, we have designed a tax calculator to assess the implicit bias of tax systems across countries. We've begun to implement that, and we have actually found that there is a lot more implicit bias in the tax systems than expected, including and particularly in the developing countries, whereas the IMF research is focused. And on that, there is a lot of research on the low-income countries specifically, because the idea is not to apply advanced economy recommendations to the emerging market and low-income countries, but really to have policies that are country-focused and appropriate for that context. So our work and our analytical work is very much low-income country focused. And as part of the IMF strategy, there will be additional work as part of surveillance, the Article 4 consultations, and also what we call deep dives into countries' gender policies and light touches. So there will be more on gender issues across countries, but again, focus on emerging market and low-income countries. Just a quick comment on the informal sector, which I agree is very important. But I think also one of the shortcomings on that is that it's hard to document. One can have anecdotal evidence or country by country focus, but across countries, this is really one of the areas that is most difficult to obtain accurate data and know precisely what's going on. So I agree that it's a concern, but the question is then how to grapple with that, presumptive tax systems included. I love the fact that Sophie talked about budget and tax, because at the end of the day, it's the public finances as a whole and their gender focus. Tax is one aspect, but the expenditure side of the budget, we know from many studies, has been more effective in closing gaps, in income gaps. And so I believe that we could also extend that to women. So looking at them both, I think, is important. And the final point on Eugénie's presentation is it's just very encouraging to hear that we're all working on this somehow through all our work, and that, you know, working together will be more important than ever. And so this is part of what we look forward to. That's it for me, François. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Catherine. C'est exactement l'objet de ce type de webinaire pour nous.
Thank you, Catherine. That's exactly the point of this webinar today. It's a new theme. Many new themes. Many organizations are starting to include this theme in their research. I can see that there are many questions in the chat. I wanted to thank you for the quality of your presentations. Now, there are many questions, and we've answered a few. Perhaps one question which widens the debate, which is the question of equality in taxation. Gender biases, which you've noticed in your various presentations, raises the question of tax equity. Hélène Picard raised the question. Would anyone care to comment? Is it correct to say that discriminating, gender discrimination leads to perverse questions in tax equity? Would anyone like to comment?
Peut-être Catherine.
Yeah, it's a
Catherine?
good question, but I think we have to be aware that the biases have been so huge against women entering the labor force through the tax systems. And this is why many advanced countries and also emerging market countries, a few low-income countries as well, have changed their legislation or are considering changing their legislation. So I think we have to, the starting point is that the playing field is not level or has not been level on tax policy and revenue administration, including customs, as Sophie mentioned. So it is really in the interest of the entire economy and the entire society to address these biases, both through the legislation, the national, I would add state and local policies, tax policies, and also how the administrations are staffed and address women in the economy. So I don't know whether that addresses the question, but that would be my brief response. Thank you, Francois.
Merci Catherine. Peut-être Michel?
Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe Michelle?
Said, and just to add very briefly as well, increasing the equality or increasing the gender equality of the tax system doesn't necessarily involve creating explicit bias for women. There's a lot you can do within a tax system that is neutral, but changing the rules of that tax system so that they no longer have adverse implications for women. That doesn't mean necessarily introducing explicit provisions for women, but it means getting rid of things that hold women back, such as in the personal income tax space, higher tax rates for second earners than for married workers. The second earners and for primary earners. That benefits all second earners, not just women, but it has a disproportionate impact on women. Another area is looking at the impact of the tax system on sole parents and people on low incomes, also predominantly women. Again, you don't need to restrict the intervention to women explicitly to have a gendered impact.
Merci beaucoup. Une autre question qui remonte.
Thank you. Another question which I can see on the chat is the question of needing analyses and data. I'm thinking of Sophie's presentation on the fact that there is no sex disaggregated data in customs or tax systems. And so there's a need to have access to that data. You've all given some elements of answers on that, but could you tell us about the tools available to do this? And also, could you say which are the best systems in order to get data and enact new systems? Catherine?
And it's a really good question. I think one of the things we have found in our country work is that some countries do have gender disaggregated data in their tax. They identify through the tax return or registration if the taxpayer is man or male or female. So some countries do have that disaggregation. And in that case, it's very interesting to be able to analyze the data. But as with everything having to do with statistics and with data, raising awareness about the need to be able to have that, I think, is very important. And we've seen countries are open to the suggestion of either looking at their databases to see if they have gender disaggregated data on their returns or their registers, or introducing such disaggregation. So again, this is, I think, an effort that will involve all of us. And this is across taxes, not by tax, of course. So just a brief observation from my side.
Je rejoins tout à fait aussi ce que dit
I
Catherine.
absolutely agree with what Catherine's just said. In Morocco, the gender analysis of the tax and customs administration was also an exercise for them. It was the first time that we were working on gender and taxation. For customs, it was particularly difficult to raise awareness, to open them up, and to get them involved in this exercise. The lack of data is a reason of this. There's such a will to have a neutral system that there was some difficulties in getting people involved. But just by giving information, just by researching the existing information, we could actually have a much better idea of who is who the taxpayers are, and we'd have a better idea of the public administration. As we're dealing with the digitalization of the entire administration, I think we will see these information systems improved, more efficient, so that they're no longer just sex disaggregated data, but also all sorts of other useful information. So yes, that's on data. And then perhaps I should also add that it's not easy for customs and for the public administration to carry out this exercise. And nevertheless, it's helped a lot. And it's also opened their perspectives on this issue. Thank you very much. Vanessa, did you want to add something?
On the topic of data, building on both of those really excellent points. I think especially just wanting to build on Catherine's point about the need for data about the informal sector. I think that is really the limiting factor, and I couldn't agree more. The data that we have is, has been either anecdotal case studies or has been, representative surveys, but in one context. So it makes it really difficult to think about comparative context. I know, however, that, for instance, we have some colleagues at the OECD that are working right now to do a scoping exercise of presumptive tax regimes across contexts. And I think that will actually be a really useful tool for at least a foundation for starting to think about the design of presumptive tax regimes. And how we can use that. And for our own parts, we are thinking about how to get more comparative data about informal sectors, not just in a context, but building on some of the work we've done to have it be broader and more representative and hopefully then more policy relevant.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your analyses on the difficulty of reaching out to the informal sector and looking at how these can be included in a tax specific way. And perhaps you said it doesn't just involve developing countries, but countries from the north are also included. I don't know if you have anything to add on the different types of, for instance, excise duty? Catherine?
Maybe I can just say one word about this from the point of view of the US tax system, where the earned income tax credit has been a very important aspect of addressing low-income families that tend now, especially after COVID, to be single women. And so really looking at not only looking at the design of the major taxes becomes even more important, I think, given in many countries and particularly the US, the increase in income inequality. And so knowing where how the current tax system is affecting low-income women and low-income families becomes even more important. And I know that there is a lot of research done, not necessarily within the public administration, but by universities and other and organizations outside the IRS or the US Treasury. So I just wanted to make that remark that goes back a bit to what Michelle was saying, that it's the design of the overall system that can really have an impact on women. And that's something that I think governments really need to be, I think, more aware of, including in the advanced economies.
Et peut-être, François, un point qui est commun
Perhaps another point that's common to countries of the South or the North. Vanessa said that income tax is lower in many countries of the South, but whether we're dealing with North and South, in general, income tax is not based on individuals, but on households. And joint personal income tax is something that's been talked about for years. And at some point, someone's going to have to do something in all countries, whether we're talking about South or North. If you look at the French example, a few studies have come out, including a study by UN Women, the Women Foundation as well, that subsidized a study on the French system. So there are lots of studies coming out at the moment, and which ought to be taken by decision makers. Thank you. Maybe to conclude, Paul Moreno is asking a question. If there was one action that could be implemented and that you could advise a Ministry of Finance to do, what would it be? To reduce these gender inequalities in the tax system? Michelle?
Excuse me. So my suggestion to take one action from Minister of Finance would be to make sure that there's a requirement in the development of tax policy that the impact of tax policy on gender be assessed, provide guidance for that, and work towards making that a routine part of all tax policy development processes.
Merci. Thank you. Catherine?
Thank you,
I
Catherine.
really like Michelle's proposal, and I would add to that the Ministry of Finance also make sure that the tax and customs administrations are on board with such policy changes and the implications for the administration, because policies need to be implemented. And so creating perhaps a group that will focus on these issues and having the Minister of Finance support and oversight could increase the chances that such positive policies can be implemented effectively.
Merci beaucoup, Vanessa.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Thank you. I would like to just build on those. I don't want to, if we only have 1 point, I think I would actually take the points that have already been said. But if we can have maybe 3 or 4 points, I think that's, I would highlight the need for the expanded data collection as we've highlighted. But also I think, Catherine already noted that a lot of sex disaggregated data does actually exist within revenue administration. So it's putting the emphasis on using it and making sure the analysis is done. I think maybe if I have an extra point, would be some greater cooperation between levels of government and ensuring that kind of thinking about how the layering of different taxes and thinking about customs, subnational taxes and things under the purview of ministries of finance can be considered at the same time.
Alors, Eugénie?
Peut-être, donc ça répète aussi également beaucoup de points qu'on a déjà.
I'm probably repeating what's already been said, but I'd say to launch a general diagnostic. Whether we're talking about tax, customs, everything. We think things are already solved and actually inequalities remain. If we have a diagnosis, we'll be able to put in place strategies which will lead to reforms of the tax system, tax services, and the tax administration. Sophie? Perhaps I'd also recommend, we're targeting the Ministry of the Economy and Finance, but we could include the Parliament as a control body the law of finance is presented to the Parliament questions the government on those provisions, and so collecting data, analyzing data, but also raising awareness, asking the right questions to the government before the law is even put forward would be useful. Thank you so much for those actions, those suggestions. Thanks once more.
Comme il y a eu beaucoup de questions sur ce sujet-là, mais effectivement, les présentations et même le...
The presentations and this video will be made available and will be published on the PISD's website. For those of you who missed bits of this meeting, you'll be able to watch it again. Once again, thanks to all the panelists for the quality of the presentations, and thanks to all the participants for their attention. We almost kept to the imparted time. Thank you very much. Thanks to Ferdy for the technical aspects of this Zoom. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.